News24 and Netwerk vier-en-twintig have been drawing and testing water samples in major metropolitan municipalities like Johannesburg, Cape Town, Durban, Pretoria, Gqeberha and Bloemfontein. The media agencies say the idea is to independently verify the quality of drinking water. For more on this conversation, we're now joined by News24 investigative journalist Phillip de Wet. Phillip, thank you so much for your time this evening. Now, News24 conducted the sampling of various water supplies. Can you give us an overview of how the study was conducted?
We're very interested in how water quality not only is but might be changing over time. And when we set out on this path, we were particularly looking at load shedding. Water management is hard enough to begin with, but the moment you bring load shedding into that equation, plants go offline, chemicals might not get mixed properly, all kinds of weird things go wrong. So we said, can we tell how water quality changes from a week-to-week basis? And this is something South Africa is not good at. We have the annual Blue Drop report, which this year is late, which tells us about water quality. We have academics who will go in and do large sample areas and check for problems with the water system. But what we don't have is a regular check on what is happening. So we saw that there was no other way to get this data than to do it ourselves. So we created the infrastructure, landed the funding, and started this process of so far we have months worth of data, and we plan to do this for at least another 2 months so that we can say over a 3-month period, here's what we see in the major cities, here's how things change or don't change, as well as how good or how bad that water is.
Now, with some of the data that you've collected, of the 151 water systems sampled, 71% were not chemically compliant and 51% had bad microbiological findings. What does this mean?
So those are the overall numbers of the latest Blue Drop report. What you have is a monitoring system run by the government, and part of the problem here is that it's monitored by the local municipalities themselves. So they do water sampling on a regular basis, and they tell us how good or how bad this is. We're due a Blue Drop report. We were due a Blue Drop report in July, which will give us that national picture. The Department of Water now says we might see it in September. So that report tells us that there is a very serious problem all over the country, that you have a large amount of non-compliance, that you have water which is perhaps dangerous in terms of the biological components, immediately dangerous, especially to more vulnerable people, to smaller children, to older people, and that you have water which over a long period of time can have negative effects on people. A lot of that, though, according to that report and according to our independent verification, is in the more rural areas. If you are in the largest cities in South Africa, we have found, frankly, astounding quality of water. We have found that the water is, in most of the cities, is absolutely outstanding. In all of the cities, is almost always, there are 1 or 2 indicators which are slightly worrying, but it's well within standard, and you can drink that water without a second thought.
Now, Phillip, you keep mentioning that the final Blue Drop report is late. Do we know why? What's contributing to the lateness of this report? And what impact does this information not being put out in time have on the information that we have about our water?
One of the reasons it's late, we hear, is because of load shedding. The Department of Water needs to talk to the various municipalities, needs to hear their side of the story, needs to give them a final input into what the findings were. And they say that in part they haven't been able to have some of those meetings because of load shedding. Look, it's also, we know what the state of local governance is in many parts of South Africa, and we believe that played a significant part of it. The problem with that is this is the report which really provides a benchmark for potential intervention. So it tells you as a consumer what the quality of the water is. It tells government on a national level and a provincial level where there are local municipalities that need help at least, and potentially, as we've seen before, may need to have their water systems taken over because they're so poorly run. So without that audit in place, we don't have that data, and everything is delayed. So the longer that report takes to come out, the more delays you have in terms of actually taking action.
So within your findings, you mentioned that load shedding is one of the big indicators in terms of what we're seeing with our water. In terms of infrastructure, have you found that do we have aging or ailing infrastructure that's affecting the quality of our water?
Not at the end point in the city. So what we're doing is we're testing the water as it comes out of a tap in that city. We're not looking at the upstream side, we're looking at the final end point. And from that, I mean, that's where you care, that's what you want to know. But from that you can tell very many things. You can tell the quality of the pipes in between. You can tell whether the reservoirs along the lines are clean. You can tell what the management is at the purification plant level. In other words, if they're using too much chlorine or too little chlorine. So that's the only thing that we're looking at. We are not trying to get access to reservoirs. We're not trying to go and look at the management protocols as they're implemented. We're looking at that water where you cannot hide the evidence. And we're doing the analysis that tells us that in the cities where we're checking, the water is of outstanding quality. I mean, we haven't even put together graphics to show our findings on stuff like bacteria and E. coli in particular, because there just is none. Not in Durban, not in Bloemfontein, not in Cape Town have we found any trace of E. coli or any problems in terms of bacteria. We found that the pH values are great throughout. We found that the level of chlorine is, if anything, a little bit too low. You want a little bit of chlorine still in the water in case you end up storing it, but that's quite low. We found that in terms of conductivity, which measures solids within the water, dissolved solids, that is looking good. So in the cities, at least, what we can tell you is that the water management must be excellent, that the infrastructure is at least in a decent state in those areas that we test, because we can tell that from the quality of the water.
That's very, very comforting to know. I mean, we saw the outbreak of cholera earlier on in the place of Hammanskraal in Gauteng. Are there any traces of a possible outbreak of cholera in Gauteng in the near future?
Not from what we've seen from extremely limited samples, but I've got to tell you, we also, when we started publishing around this, we asked our readers how they perceive their water, expecting people to have many complaints, because this is South Africa. Water is hard. Water is a local competence. Local governments often aren't great at these kinds of tasks. So we expected to have a lot of people complain about their water. What we've had is the opposite. We've had the vast majority of people saying either that they love the quality of their water. They can only tell from taste and smell. There might be hidden factors in there. But as far as they're concerned, they love their water. The vast majority of South Africans tell us they happily drink the water that comes out of the taps. And then you have these problem areas, and they tend to be more rural areas, and they tend to be in poorer provinces where you would expect them, where we've heard many problems in other forms of governance. If you can see potholes in the main street, then chances are that the quality of the water isn't that great either.
In closing, from the findings that you have out of this report, what would you say needs to be done to maintain that good standard of quality water that we have in our cities, and what more do we need to do, especially in the rural areas, in order to get to the standards of where the cities are?
Everything that we hear time and time again from the Auditor General, from the likes of the Blue Drop Report, from academics and independent verification, every time tells us that there isn't sufficient money going into water infrastructure, that there is a large focus on things such as electricity and things such as even housing provision, and that there's not sufficient focus going into water. So there needs to be more money, there needs to be skills that are captured and held within those areas, and there needs to be a great focus on that. And unfortunately, we only see the problems when things completely break down. By the time you see water come out of a tap that's brown and that's murky, the problems have been brewing for a long time, and it's very hard to fix. So what we believe we need is a lot more academic testing, a lot more government testing, and a lot more regular watchdogging of the quality of the water before things go terribly awry.
All right, Phillip, thank you so much for your time this evening. Certainly it is very interesting to know that we have good quality water, especially in our cities. Thank you so much for that report.